Video games are a form of art. While it can be difficult to define what art is and then bring things into that category, it is even more difficult, if not impossible, to exclude specific creative works or entire mediums of creative works from being qualified as art. This is a statement and belief that is essential to understanding video games as a medium, but is also going to be necessary in order to follow along with the general premise of this video. Because with this discussion, I hope to connect the component parts of a game with artistic movements of the past. Now that we have that baseline understanding, Dark Souls 3 is a fantastically crafted game, from its cryptic and mysterious narrative to its world building. It has wonderfully designed systems, mechanics, and features from top to bottom. It is enjoyable to play, engaging to watch, and fascinating to explore. These are all great praises to have for a game, but today, as mentioned, I want to discuss Dark Souls 3 as a piece of art. An interesting quirk of video games to consider is that even though they are art, they have not been around for nearly as long as more traditional forms of art, such as painting or writing. Those two mediums have centuries of history to them, movements, periods, and thematic patterns of style that encompass the cultural zeitgeist of the time. You could argue that games have had such distinguished chapters in their development, but because of their unique cultural positioning, they tend more towards adaptation and adoption of styles rather than pioneering new ones. Just to elaborate on this point, the video game industry has its roots in the late 60s, and since then has undergone massive changes with regards to market trends, artistic direction, design patterns and design trends, as well as just an overall view of itself and its view by others from the outside. But obviously, the time from the late 1960s to now is nowhere near as long as the amount of time that the written word or literature or paintings or drawing has been around. So while there may be popular movements or like patterns among games, you often don't have these decades-long artistic and thematic tethers that tie all games in a certain era together in some way, shape, or form. And, as a tangent among the tangent, it also has to be recognized that we're looking back on these artistic movements from history with the benefit of hindsight and seeing the works that did last and that were popular enough with the people of the time that they are still well known now. And we don't have that same luxury when looking at games from the past 10, 20, or even 30 or 40 years. Enough time just hasn't passed yet for us to see what games will truly stand the test of time. So now, if you've played Dark Souls, you might be thinking that based on its excessively morose undertones and dark fantasy aesthetic, that Dark Souls 3 would fit more into the Gothic genre of art. Even if you haven't played it, the name Dark Souls alone might be enough to evoke thoughts of Gothic imagery or darkness and death. It has depictions of mighty gods, vast cathedrals, motifs of death and horror, and overall gloom. However, I believe it has far more in common, and this will be the main crux of the video, with the Romanticism movement. Romanticism was and is a cultural movement that extended to everything from visual and performative art, writing and literature, as well as philosophy and ways of looking at the self, society, and the world at large. Most sources will say that the Romantic period was in its height around the time of 1810 to 1840, give or take a few years on either end. It dealt with themes of nature, interconnectedness, and emotion, and the 5 I's: idealism, inspiration, imagination, intuition, and individuality. So today, I want to talk about how Dark Souls 3 is, in many ways, a game that borrows heavily and is of the Romantic movement, even though it was made more than a full century later. While it's true that all pictures tell a story, and all stories paint a picture, I want to divide Dark Souls into at least 2 constituent parts: Romanticism as it relates to its visual aspects, and Romanticism as it relates to its narrative aspects. First, looking at visuals, disregarding narrative. Though, do remember that all pictures tell a story, and as such, all of these landscapes and locations will tell a story just in the level design alone. One of the more consistent themes of Romanticism, and the one I want to mention first so that you can notice it throughout the rest of these, is having evocative and oftentimes dark imagery. Not always dark as in sinister, but definitely sometimes that. By dark here, I mean limited or purposely diminished lighting. Romantic art tends to be very emotional, allowing very different people to look at it and each take away their own personal sentiment. It is often highly subjective, for better or worse. And with that, Dark Souls 3 has many of these unique moments that if they were to be taken as just artistic pieces, still images, to be looked at would fit right at home with romantic art. For example, entering Irithyll, seeing the bridge lead over to the city with a moon and a skyline that both seem to be frozen in time. The color palette and the very representation of the city both make it seem very cold and distant and mysterious. My next favorite example is the pinnacle of dark scenes and dark environments. The Untended Graves being a visual recreation of Firelink Shrine and the area leading up to that, but with a pitch black sky. This takes the visuals of the first area and allows a different take on the lighting situation to bring out some of the more ominous tones and highlight just how important having natural lighting can be to making an area feel safe. A personal favorite of mine is the dark sun over Lothar Castle, or the Undead Settlement. The ominous dark sign eclipse of the sun backlights a burning sky, bathing areas that the player has already visited in a new, unsettling, and unfamiliar light. For the Undead Settlement in particular, the dark sun adds an almost apocalyptic feel to all the different skeletal trees reaching up towards the sky, and the ramshackle town that seems to be falling apart. There are more examples, of course, but I do want to move on to the second point. Next, we have nature versus industrialization. And it should be noted that industrialization, in the context of Dark Souls, might not mean so much of smoke and manufacturing as the Industrial Revolution meant to the Romantic movement, but may instead be taken as stonework, castles, and engineering, man-made structures and accomplishment, similar to what the Industrial Revolution meant. The castles and such specifically will come up later, but for now we can look at several examples of nature overpowering industry. Firstly, you have Farron Keep. Essentially, the entirety of Farron Keep is a castle that is, at first, looking like it has just been crumbling and has fallen to the decay of nature over the years. The lower part of Farron Keep, the swamp, shows a castle, a kingdom, and several structures being almost literally swallowed by the earth itself, sinking into the swamp with the peaks of towers jutting out above the muck. Even the selection of enemies shifts from knights in armor to these grotesque creatures that look like they have masses of organic material growing on and off of them. There is similar imagery with the demon ruins and the smoldering lake. Again, you have this ancient civilization with intricate stonework that is being smothered by water, lava, refuse, and otherwise a decaying and crumbling environment. Growths jut out of the walls, as well as almost mummified remains and vines in some of the twisting and winding corridors. All parts of the ruins that aren't already destroyed look like they're being overtaken by overgrowth and vines. Next is the Undead Settlement, a small village that feels like all of the buildings are not only compressed together, but stacked on each other in layers. Throughout the town are disturbing and macabre tree-like skeletons that reach up towards the sky. What few stone structures and walkways remain are infested with plant life, with flowers and vines poking out between the cobblestones. Particularly, the boss of this area, the Curse-Rotted Greatwood, is in an arena that is brimming with nature, even though it was a man-made structure. Almost all parts of the Undead Settlement have fallen into disrepair, allowing natural plant life to make a resurgence in the area. Romanticism also has a deep nostalgia for the past, specifically a glorification of the Dark Ages. This kind of influence can be found everywhere in the game, from the armor and weaponry to the enemies and bosses. Just the visual design of many of the characters refers back to feudal European knights, Arthurian legend, or otherwise Central and Western European nobility. Princes, knights, shields, swords, and crowns all contribute to this nostalgia. We can also see an emphasis on the importance of knightly duty, chivalry, and the keeping of oaths, specifically from characters like Sigmire, the main character, Morn, and Henri and Horus. I also want to briefly dive into their respective stories. Sigmire is bound by a promise made to Yorm the Giant that, should Yorm refuse his duty, Sigmire would come to do what must be done and reclaim his soul. He travels far, fights alongside the main character, and is even captured, but never forgets his promise. Morn is steadfast in his efforts to protect Irina, and is never far should the player hurt her. His oath is one of a sworn guardian, and he never breaks it. Henri and Horus are two knights that have made a pact with each other to destroy Aldrich in retribution for his crimes. They are always seen together until extenuating circumstances tear them apart. If and when that happens, Henri attempts to kill Horus in a form of mercy killing, so that he suffers no longer. If Henri never finds Horus, then Henri is still beholden to their original oath, and they kill Aldrich with the help of the main character. The romanticizing of honor and chivalry can also be seen in the inverse, with characters like Hawkwood, the crestfallen warrior, always being in a sullen and dejected pose. He is a character who betrayed his oaths and went back on his knightly duty. His posture and dialogue are both equal indicators of his own disappointment and humiliation with the actions that he has taken in his life. One of the better-known elements of narrative romanticism is man's struggle against nature and nature's inevitable victory, the prime example of this being Moby Dick. Now, in order to talk about the narrative aspects of Dark Souls, there do need to be some caveats made. Firstly, a lot of this information is going to be technically speculation, but on this I am going to appeal to the authority of members of the Dark Souls community who have spent hundreds upon hundreds of hours finding, compiling, and analyzing all the information that I will be using here. Second is that in order to emphasize the points properly and adequately explain the things I want to talk about, there will be times where I have to reach back to previous Dark Souls games in order to bring up examples or provide context for examples given. With that out of the way, the ultimate example of man's struggle against nature and nature's victory would have to be the initial advent of the Dark Sign to end the Age of Fire, at the very beginning of Dark Souls 1. Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, believing himself a god, did all that he could to keep himself and his own kingdom immortal, only to be undermined by nature's denial and refusal of that request. The Dark Sign, which ended up bringing about the Chosen Undead, who ultimately destroyed Gwyn, and either chose to continue the Age of Fire or usher in the Age of Dark. If one chooses to view all aspects of the dark and the abyss within the Dark Souls games as a metaphor for nature, as a stand-in for nature, it makes the seminal conflict of heat and cold, life and death, light and dark, also of man versus nature. If you can make that leap, the entire eternal struggle of Dark Souls 1, wherein a Lord of Cinder must choose to link the flame or go dark, ends up fitting the role of man versus nature perfectly. Eventually, the Age of Dark always comes, and nature always wins. This can also be seen throughout Dark Souls 2 and 3, with all of the different Lords of Cinder being those who chose to link the fire before. But the very fact that there are multiple Lords of Cinder is clear indication that eventually someone comes around and chooses the Age of Dark, allowing the cycle to repeat itself. An element of romanticism that goes hand in hand with nature's victory over man is generally the vast power and unknowable aspects of nature. Now, for the most part, this is going to be very easy to apply to the world of Dark Souls, with great unknowable forces dictating the way that the world works, and things such as the unkindled ash and the soul of cinder and what caused the first flame all being things shrouded in mystery, just being the world making its own decisions. In many ways, especially in Dark Souls 3, the world as a concept can very much be seen as its own character, or at least as an independent entity capable of making decisions and choosing self-preservation rather than a monotonous, unchanging existence. For example, unkindled ash are raised from nothing as a last resort to link the flame by any means necessary when all of the previous Lords of Cinder refuse their call. And there is a general uncertainty around why the Lords of Cinder were resurrected and how the unkindled ash came to be, why all the different timelines are converged in one location. There are a lot of things that are unknown about the Dark Souls world. A third pattern is seen that is kind of the narrative counterpart of nature versus industrialization, is that because Romanticism was hot on the heels of the Enlightenment era, there was a potent rejection of science and scientific advancement in lieu of favoring gods or nature. Though I should specify, this does not include the man-made gods of Dark Souls, those that found their power elsewhere, given to them by natural causes. But I digress. Each of the lords in Dark Souls 3, each of the Lords of Cinder, tried to outsmart nature by locking themselves away in palaces and refusing the call to the flame. All of these different Lords of Cinder inevitably fall to the unkindled ash. The twin princes Lorien and Lothric, in particular, know of their choice that they're making, choosing to stay locked away, and allowing the world to fall into disrepair. Through their dialogue, you can tell that they know what they're doing, and the people around them want them to just bite the bullet, cut their losses, and do what they have to do, perform their duty, and be a Lord of Cinder. A strange theme of Romanticism also revolves around mortality and immortality, particularly versions of cursed immortality, hubris from avoiding one's nature that leads to unceasing pain and an inability to escape that pain. The perfect example of this in Dark Souls 3 commingles with the idea of knightly duty and is best exemplified by the Abyss Watchers, a group of knights that is constantly being resurrected by virtue of being Lords of Cinder, and yet are constantly being corrupted by their proximity to the Abyss, and so are in this constant, unending fight where they must kill each other, be resurrected, kill each other in order to fight off the Abyss, be resurrected as virtue of being a Lord of Cinder, until they are eventually killed and their soul consumed as one by the unkindled ash, the main character. The Abyss in particular is of interesting note. Again, if we take the Abyss to be a stand-in, a metaphorical replacement for nature, it's interesting that any and all who try to beat or use the Abyss for their own gains eventually fail, and oftentimes many are even corrupted by the Abyss just by being close to it. Characters from entities from Artorias to the Four Kings to the various kings of Dark Souls 2, even its progenitor, Manus, and the final Arbiter Gale, all seek to embody the Abyss, or draw from it in some way, or are simply corrupted by it by trying to defeat it, and all of them inevitably fall. Because nature, in any form, cannot be contained. It cannot be used, it cannot be abused. It will eventually overtake you. Now, besides the larger points of visuals versus narrative, there are some minor aspects of Dark Souls 3 that do lend themselves as references to Romanticism, but are nowhere near as rich in the reading that they can provide. For example, and I'll just list some of these off, there, again, the rejection of Rescience and Enlightenment ideas. The Grand Archives in general are in complete disarray, and books, presumably containing knowledge, literally have hands that reach out of them and attempt to curse you. There are imperfect and arrogant creations of man. Think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This can be found in the different pontiff beasts and the various different outrider knights that pursue the main character. And literally the entire concept of Aldrich, this individual person who consumes so much in an attempt to gain more power and ends up creating an abomination of himself. Romanticism generally includes a rebellion against established order, and the Lords of Cinder, especially as previously mentioned, the Twin Princes, reject their duty as heirs of flame. Even going a step further, looking at the unkindled ash as a character, they must fight their way against the newly established order of denying the flame, as the entire world seems to be united in this idea of we will not give in, and so the unkindled ash has to go out and rectify the situation. And I mentioned at the very beginning that Romanticism was also a philosophical movement, and I didn't talk about that anywhere near as much, but some quick points I want to go over. The world is literally stacks on stacks of eras, with cities being built on top of caves, underneath other cities. Timelines and entire continents are seemingly connected when centuries or entire millennia should have separated them. There are old civilizations resting under new ones, and time as a concept has ceased to matter. This goes hand in hand with Romanticism's deep interest and nostalgia for the past. There are legacies and legends and myths and gods and men that all exist in the same context. This can be seen most viscerally in places such as the Dreg Heap, where dozens upon dozens of towns and cities and castles and villages, even some from the previous Dark Souls games, can be seen just tossed to the side and left to gather dust. But I do also want to mention some of the aspects of Dark Souls 3 that don't translate into Romanticism quite as cleanly. The entire painted world of Ariandel is a very messy translation and kind of reversal of the standard Dark Souls, for lack of a better word, allegory. Generally speaking, in Dark Souls, you have an Age of Fire that needs to be ended and cut short by an Age of Dark. But it's very much that the Age of Fire is continuing with the Age of Fire means to prolong what is already going on. It is unchanging. Fire means stagnation. But in the painted world of Ariandel, if the world is to continue uninterrupted, it instead leads to rot, because of the more magical nature of the painted world. And so it's a strange flip of some of the themes that were talked about before, where in order for the world to be cleansed and reset, instead of the overwhelming power of the abyss of dark and of therefore nature. In this case, nature becomes the flame that burns away everything instead of being the rot that overwhelms the world. I don't know. It's nowhere near as clean of a representation of Romanticism, but I still wanted to bring it up anyways because this isn't a perfect one-to-one matchup of Dark Souls 3 and Romanticism. Oftentimes, many works are not 100% a certain thing. And that's why it's always interesting and rewarding to interpret things in multiple ways. And there are definitely other things, and there are definitely other aspects of Dark Souls 3 that don't line up as well with Romanticism. And there are likely some that do align more with Gothic genres instead, or horror genres, or maybe even postmodern genres. But with this video, I did want to talk about the Romanticism aspects, because there are a lot of those, and they do connect very well with each other. Just some brief examples of things that don't mesh quite as well would be the various covenants, the entirety of the Lord of Hollows subplot, and artifacts like the transposing kiln. Just at least through my research, I couldn't find ways that they would connect cleanly with Romanticism. I know this video isn't necessarily standard for what else on this channel, but I did want to try something new. Plus, this is something that's been on my mind for quite a while, ever since I saw a speaker at the East Coast Game Conference talking about how Bloodborne was in many ways a romantic work as well, and so I figured that the Dark Souls series might give similar insight. I do hope to do these kind of videos a little bit more, looking at specific games as part of a specific artistic movement, but that remains to be seen. We'll see what happens. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.